And I rise here tonight to raise a very serious and consequential issue that is taking place in our nation's capital. Washington, D.C., our federal city, the second hometown of every American, is just weeks away from implementing a deadly assisted suicide program. The D.C. City Council recently passed a so-called Death with Dignity Act. This would allow adults who have been diagnosed with a terminal disease and who have been told they only have 6 months or less to live to receive a prescription from their doctor to end their life. 6 states, including California, Oregon, Vermont, Washington, Montana, and Colorado, have already headed down this dangerous path. I raise this issue tonight, Mr. Speaker, because our founders gave Congress the power in the Constitution to, quote, exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district that would become the seat of the government of the United States. As a result, this Congress has the opportunity to stop this law. I'm grateful that my colleagues are here tonight to join me. Dr. Renstrup, Mr. Heiss, Dr. Harris, Dr. Hartzler, Dr. Marshall. They are joining me tonight to speak in defense of patients who deserve protection, especially when dealing with the unimaginable difficulty of a terminal disease. Like me, they are deeply troubled that in Washington, D.C., an alabaster city that gleams as a beacon for the principles on which we were founded, that this policy is about to be put in place, jeopardizing the lives of the most vulnerable among us. Mr. Speaker, Washington, D.C. is indeed a remarkable city. I still remember coming to this special place as a 10-year-old child with my parents, coming down the George Washington Parkway in Virginia, as millions of other tourists have, with excitement to see our national monuments and the Capitol in which I now speak. We Americans approach this city with awe, as we know how Washington is intertwined with our nation's history, and that this city both guards our nation's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and hosts the very government that our Constitution envisioned. Those founding documents frame a republic grounded in the principles of sovereignty in the people, subject to the protection of God-given, inalienable rights, among them the right to life, liberty, and to pursue happiness. Nowhere, Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, is the view of this city more beautiful than from the hills of Arlington Cemetery in Virginia, and specifically the resting place of our 35th President, John F. Kennedy. One cannot think of President Kennedy without thinking also of his inaugural address, which was a call to action for a new generation of Americans. That call was grounded in the exceptional nature of our land. Yet, President Kennedy said, the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. D.C.'s assisted suicide law, Mr. Speaker, threatens the inalienable rights of vulnerable citizens. Not only does the new D.C. statute tear at the tapestry of our nation's founding, it directly contradicts the Hippocratic oath every physician takes to do no harm. I shudder to think of the lives that will be lost because our society tells the weak, the despairing, the suffering, or the hopeless that suicide is the best option for them. Laws similar to the D.C. Death with Dignity Act in the U.S. and Europe have resulted in individuals being pressured to end their lives, and insurance companies covering reimbursements for suicide treatment, but not for other care. If patients find themselves unable to pay for expensive treatments out of pocket, they may find their options severely limited when facing a new diagnosis, facing a disability, or struggling with mental illness. In some cases, death may become the only affordable option. Proponents of physician-assisted suicide point to real and tragic stories of suffering in individuals at the end of their lives. However, according to a report by the National Institutes of Health, pain is not the primary factor motivating patients to seek a lethal dose of medication. More commonly cited motivations include depression, hopelessness, and the loss of control or autonomy. Allowing physicians to prescribe lethal medication to these patients would mean we are abandoning our nation's most vulnerable citizens and instead succumb to a culture that is worse than the disease. Instead of death and despair that are the underlying principles of assisted suicide, our law should reflect a culture that promotes life and hope, even in our suffering, even in our illness, and even in our weakness. Jeanette Hall of Oregon was diagnosed with cancer in the year 2000. She was a supporter of her state's assisted suicide program, and she even voted for it. She considered taking her own life with the help of her physician when she learned she only had 6 months to live. Thankfully, she had a life-affirming doctor who simply asked her how her son, who was attending the police academy at the time, would feel about it. This made her stop and think. His question inspired her to opt for radiation and chemotherapy instead of suicide, and over a decade later, she is still sharing her testimony. She is extremely happy to still be alive. I have no doubt that Americans like Jeanette with chronic illnesses, disabilities, or struggling with mental illness will be exploited under this law, or perhaps even encouraged to pursue suicide rather than continue living until natural death. This dangerous trend is already taking shape in the 6 states that have legalized physician-assisted suicide. Precious lives have already met a premature end. Mr. Speaker, there is dignity in all human life, and the root meaning of dignity is worth. Nothing, not illness, not weakness or despair, can decrease the worth of a human life. I cannot stand idly by and watch our laws corrupt our culture. And I'm thankful to be joined by several of my colleagues who refuse to let this dark policy move forward unchecked.